Defense. Following the first Gulf War, Dick Cheney, who served as Secretary of Defense during that conflict, explained why the invasion and occupation of Baghdad would be disastrous.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. The other thing was casualties. Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for the president in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
All that Dick Cheney then predicted has tragically come true, due in large part to the deceptive campaign for war waged by Vice President Cheney and by President Bush. The costs of the war into which we were deceived have been overwhelming. As of August 2007, over 3,600 brave American men and women have been killed in Iraq. Over 27,000 have been wounded, many with severe lifelong injuries. And Iraqi society has become destabilized by rampant criminality and savage daily violence. The costs of the war to the Iraqi people, who are much worse off, have been massive and tragic. Resentment, hostility, and hatred toward the United States, causing even more terrorism, have increased dramatically because of President Bush's atrocities. Consider this scene of U.S. servicewoman Sabrina Harmon smiling and giving a thumbs up over the body of Manadel al-Jamadi, who was killed after being tortured at Abu Ghraib. Here are the wife and son of Manadel al-Jamadi holding that photograph. The U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq has no doubt been the best terrorist recruiting tool bin Laden could ever have hoped for. The hatred of the United States by much of the Muslim world will last for generations. In fact, a September 2006 National Intelligence estimate concluded that the overall terrorist threat against the United States has grown since September 11, 2001, and that the Bush administration's actions have helped foment a new generation of Islamic radicalism. People around the world, reportedly more than 150, have been kidnapped by U.S. agents and transported to other countries where they have been held incommunicado and tortured. No information has been provided to their families about their whereabouts or circumstances. Imagine a loved one simply disappearing. This disgraceful, immoral, cruel, illegal CIA practice has been approved by President Bush.
Mr. President, can you explain why you've approved of and expanded the practice of what's called rendition, of transferring individuals out of U.S. custody to countries where human rights groups and your own State Department say torture is common for people in custody?
Post 9/11 world, the United States must make sure we protect our people and our friends from attack. That was the charge we have been given. And one way to do so is to arrest people and send them back to their country of origin with the promise that they won't be tortured. That's the promise we receive. This country does not believe in torture. We do believe in protecting ourselves. We don't believe in torture.
President Bush was not telling us the truth. United States agents were not sending kidnapped people back to their homes. They were being sent to torture chambers of other nations. We have always thought of torture as being a despicable, inhumane tool that other totalitarian outlaw nations utilized. Now, the United States has, for the first time, forfeited our historical moral standing and joined the ranks of nations that, as a matter of officially sanctioned policy, kidnap, disappear, and torture human beings. The torture and killing of dozens of people in U.S. custody and the hundreds of cases of cruel torture at the hands of U.S. personnel in Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo, and elsewhere have been in blatant violation of the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Convention Against Torture. It is also a violation of statutes passed by Congress, including the War Crimes Act of 1996 and the Foreign Affairs Reform and Restructuring Act of 1998. Given the scale, frequency, and moral depravity of these outrages, President Bush must be held to account through impeachment and removal from office. If we do not call for accountability, we are complicit. Our Constitution is the bedrock of our system of government. It is intended to protect U.S. citizens against governmental abuses of our individual liberties, including the warrantless wiretapping of our emails, phone conversations, and other communications. Following abuses by President Nixon, Congress enacted the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978, which said it is a criminal act to engage in domestic electronic surveillance without obtaining a warrant. On April 20, 2004, President Bush represented that because we value the Constitution, a wiretap requires a court order.
Now, by the way, anytime you hear the United States government talking about wiretap, a wiretap requires a court order. Nothing has changed, by the way. When we're talking about chasing down terrorists, we're talking about getting a court order before we do so. It's important for our fellow citizens to understand, when you think Patriot Act, constitutional guarantees are in place when it comes to doing what is necessary to protect our homeland because we value the Constitution.
Once again, he was deceiving the American people. In mid-December 2005, we learned that President Bush for years had ordered the highly secretive National Security Agency to engage in the warrantless wiretapping of U.S. citizens' emails, phone calls, and other communications in violation of the Constitution and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. When President Bush's secret surveillance program was challenged, federal judge Anna Taylor found the separation of powers doctrine has been violated. She found that President Bush violated the Constitution and federal statutory law. Without addressing the question of President Bush's blatant violations of the Constitution and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, in a recent 2-1 opinion, reversed Judge Taylor's decision. Its ruling was based on a finding that the plaintiffs did not have standing to assert their claims. The split court held that the state secrets doctrine prevents the plaintiffs from discovering whether their communications were actually intercepted by the government, rendering them unable to prove any actual injury, even if what President Bush did was blatantly unconstitutional and a violation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. In other words, the president's unconstitutional criminal misconduct could not be challenged in the courts. The dissenter, Judge Gilman, pointed out that the plaintiff lawyers, reasonably fearful that the communications would be intercepted without a warrant, could no longer speak with people overseas who might be able to assist with cases being handled by the lawyers. Therefore, those plaintiffs suffered clear harm and should have standing to challenge the constitutional and statutory violations by the president.